Well, hello there. Today we have a HOSS 3.0 in the shop. Not a HOSS 1.0 or 2.0, but a HOSS 3.0. And this HOSS 3.0 has failed. This broke exactly like a HOSS 2.0. Had the very same initial failure that I had on my HOSS 2.0, as a matter of fact. So something I just want to point out about this HOSS 3.0 is it really isn't a whole lot stronger in certain areas than the HOSS 2.0 setup. Specifically in the area where this retention bolt is. And what you've got going on here, again, it's the same problem with the HOSS 2.0, is this very small amount of material in the cast aluminum holding this bolt in. So when we get a shock load to the system here and this rack bar gets flexed, it puts a sudden shock load on that bolt and pops this cap right off your rack. So that's just what we saw on this one. A friend of mine was wheeling this thing down in Kentucky last weekend, and that's what happened with him. So he's now running his HOSS 2.0. He's got that back in the truck temporarily just to keep him back in action. And we're going to go ahead and do a teardown on this HOSS 3.0, inspect all the internals to see if there's any more damage internally, and then we'll go from there. Oh, and just like on our HOSS 2.0, we can use our rack brace, and we can put that on there and get this rack back into service. Before I even contemplate any repairs, first thing I want to know is, was there any internal damage to this? Did the rack bar get bent? Is there any damage to the teeth on the rack or the pinion? And then the internal bushing and bearing down here by the motor. And we'll inspect the ball nut. The other thing we're noticing right away is quite a lot of rust on our on the lead screw on the rack bar here, the ball screw. I'm seeing that to be a pretty common thing with these. A note on disassembly. Again, we want to be making sure that we keep the orientation of everything in the stock orientation when we're disassembling, so that it goes back together, and we're going to note that and mark that. I'm going to have this set up so that everything's at neutral, as if you're in the vehicle with the steering wheel pointed straight ahead. So on the driver's side of the rack, there'll be a groove here for the retention bolt, so we're going to keep that oriented facing toward the driver's side. Your rack bar on each side should extend from your housing about 2.28 inches from either side. And that's what we got. So I'm going to make a couple of notes, or a couple of marks. One I'm going to put on top, and then I'm going to put some marks on the gears. There'll be 3 gears in here to deal with. One on the pinion shaft itself. Then you'll have 2 small plastic gears on the actual circuit board here, which is your position encoder. So make sure as you extract these components out of the rack housing that you don't lose that gear mesh, so that you can maintain that orientation. I can't stress that enough. That's about the only thing you really need to be concerned about when you're disassembling. Everything else is something you can work around, but you really need to keep that orientation. Alright, so here we have the passenger side housing. On my right, your left is the HOSS 3.0, and right here is the HOSS 2.0. So as far as a direct comparison, far as the general housing goes, this material condition is basically identical. So there's no extra wall thickness here. Okay, same wall thickness, so same strength. There are some improvements around the bigger opening on this end for the larger bellows. You do have slightly larger gusseting. So we can see at the top there, I've got the top facing down right now. You can see the gusset here that almost doesn't exist on the 2.0. There's a little bit more rib right here. And then this rib here is also a bit bigger. And then on the back side there's a rib that we don't have on the HOSS 2.0. Now when my HOSS 2.0 passenger side blew out, where it blew out, there's no extra ribbing in that area. And let's check to see if there's actually a thickness difference in the wall right in that area. It's exactly the same. It is a larger diameter, so you're going to spread out loads a little bit more, so that is going to be inherently stronger. However, where I've seen these housings fail around the mating area, that's all the same thicknesses and same dimensions. I see a couple spots here and there where the casting is a little more filled in, so there's a little bit more strength around these bottom two ears here. But yet you're still pushing the failure point to a stress riser that has the same stress riser on this. So I would expect the same failure conditions between those two. Yes, this one is a little stronger, but it still has the same weak points. Same thickness in the casting. Alright, now we're going to look at our belt drive. And let me check that part number. I believe these are the same parts internally with the HOSS 2.0, but let's just go ahead and verify that. 3825, 9141. Yep, same part number pulley. And I'm sure the belt is the same part as well, as that would follow. 3824, 6351. There we go. Alright. So this motor is extended. I have this 3D printed mock-up of the HOSS 2.0 motor. And that motor appears to be about 3/4 of an inch longer. So, meaning you're going to get more torque out of this motor. I believe the number given is 30% or 33%. Yeah, and that's 3/4 of an inch longer motor. But it's driving through the same drive mechanism with no enhancement there. Alright, so now I'm going to pull the motor, the drive assembly here, and ball nut and bearing. And we'll just verify all those are the same part numbers as well. Alright, I was just checking on the ball screw, looking for any damage. Everything in there looks good, other than the rust on the ball screw itself. Also want to point out this rack. We installed this rack in my buddy Zach's Bronco. I want to say it's been less than 3 months. I don't think it's been 3 months yet. Maybe it has, but it feels like 2 months, honestly. And you know, we've already lost it, so pretty disappointing, obviously. There's a lot of rubber fragments in the bottom of this housing, but I've also just found metal shavings. I don't know if we'll be able to focus on that or not, but it looks like aluminum shavings from the housing. There's also significant damage, I don't think I'll be able to get this on camera, but to the bushing in here. The bushing is distorted, it's partially pulled out of place, and I would say the back side of it Make sure I have my orientation correct here. Yes, the back side of the bushing is half worn away. So this is a flanged bushing. So it actually has more contact surface than the HOSS 2.0. But a lot of that surface is just gone. So we'll pull that out and get a better look at that. Alright, I can see right away we've got a fair amount of metal shavings on the driver's side as well. So we're going to have to make sure that that's all metal from the housing and not from the gears. Although that does look like steel, unfortunately. We'll get a closer look. Get a closer look once we have everything out of there. Now with all these components internally being the same as the HOSS 2.0, if you've already got a HOSS 2.0, so you could source some parts from that if say the screw is damaged or the rack or the pinion, but we'll verify those are in fact the exact same Ford part numbers. You will need a set of 16-inch snap ring pliers to pull these big snap rings out of this housing. Just also want to point out that when you remove this, you'll notice there's a bevel on the outside, let's say. So facing you, when you pull this out, there's a bevel there. Remember that orientation, you'll need that when you put this back in. So that bevel, again, is facing toward you when you pull this out of the rack. So I'm just going to keep it on the pliers just to make it easy for me to recall. And just like on the HOSS 2.0, when you're removing the pinion, it'll require a special tool. I've made one here, which is a piece of CNC metal pressed into a 1-inch socket here. Same part number. Alright, once you've removed the nut underneath, retaining the pinion in, we're going to take the pinion out. We're going to be very, very careful to make sure that the pinion does not get separated from the PCB here as we come out of the housing. This little plastic housing on this that gives you this 90-degree bend here, this needs to come off before you can get it through here. Alright, so I've maintained the gear mesh so that these gears are still hard located to the gear on the pinion. So without allowing that to come apart, very carefully turn this over and I'm going to mark these gears. You got a white gear and a black gear, so what I do is I'll use a black marker and I try to do this all in its home orientation. That again is with this shaft out 2.28 inches from the end of the housing. This round key in the shaft for the retention bolt facing the passenger side. So I'm just going to mark the tooth that's meshing on the small white gear with a black mark, and then with a paint marker, let's do red or white, but have something on here so that you can't mix up the two. I'm going to mark the meshing gear here, like so. Once you have that noted, carefully take these straight apart, and then don't let these gears spin. Set this aside somewhere where it can't get bumped. It's also not a bad idea. Put a piece of tape across there and hold those gears directly in place just as you've removed them until you're ready to reassemble. A piece of masking tape will work just fine for that. Also recommend being careful you're dealing with a printed circuit board. Make sure you don't electrostatically zap that thing because you could cause damage to it and you don't want to replace that. So there we are. We'll keep him safe out of the way until we're ready to reassemble. Now the first thing I want to do with the pinion out is inspect the gears. And unfortunately, we have significant damage to these gears. So I'm going to recommend that we don't reinstall this pinion and that we replace it. If you're in a pinch, you can clean up the abrasions on these gear teeth, reassemble and rerun this thing, but that is going to shorten the life of your rack assembly. So my recommendation, it's got damage, replace it. We'll get a new part in there. Alright, now we'll get the rack bar out and see how the rack bar survived relative to the pinion. We're also going to want to check the bearings in here to make sure the bearings aren't damaged. If you're planning on reusing this housing, those bearings will have to be in good shape, and you'll have to make sure they're free of debris. So make sure there's no shavings that count down in there or any other dust or debris. If you're switching over to our rack housing, this comes preloaded with heavy-duty bearings. So you do not need to press these bearings out and press them into our housing. Our housing will already come with bearings pressed in, ready to accept your pinion shaft. And pinion, same part number again. So we'll use, in this case, if we build up this rack for Zach, we will use his HOSS 2.0 pinion. We'll of course inspect that for damage as well. Alright, so here's the bushing we just pulled out of the passenger side of this HOSS 3.0. I don't know how well we can see that on camera, but it's pretty trashed. It was really seeing a lot of loading on the back side, and it was already starting to peel the bushing out of the housing, and you can see it's crushed and the flange is gone from one side there. By the way, here's your HOSS 2.0 bushing. So they're the same thickness, except for this one has this little bit of flange that goes inside the housing and gives you more contact surface. But you know, it's a very thin piece of plastic right there. Just inspecting the bearing on the load bolt here. It also is referred to as a guide bolt. Okay, it looks good. I don't see any damage. Hold on. No, there is damage. I see some small damage. What I'm seeing is, it looks like damage from some small pieces of some metal shavings that got in between the load bolt here and the bearing surface on the rack bar. It's very minor. Well, now something I'm noting right away is a lot of rust. This shaft is rusty from one end to the other. The area where the ball screw is running back and forth has rust in it. It's the least rusty area, probably just because the ball screw has kept it kind of cleaned up. Or the front bearing surface on the rack bar looks fine. Okay, the rack bar does have damage, so I wouldn't recommend reusing this rack bar. Again, Zach, who owns this HOSS 3.0, has a HOSS 2.0, and we have the same internal components. So if we're going to build for him the VX Offroad Rock Rack, we'll just swap in, after inspection, some of his HOSS 2.0 components so that he can build a complete good rack without having to purchase another. So that will conclude our teardown of the HOSS 3.0. Now that we have it all apart, I just want to do a little bit more side-by-side comparison in the housings. So from this view here, you can see that there's more ribbing on the center section of the housing. Now I have seen center sections of these fail in very extreme circumstances, but it's not the normal failure mode for these racks. The most common failure point that I see is blowing the cap off here, blowing out the ends of the housings. And that's because you're shock loading the system, you're bending the rack bar, and that rack bar is putting loads into the housing where there's no reinforcement in the housing. Now we can do a little bit of reinforcing in the housing by adding bushings on the passenger side and the driver's side, upgraded housings, and that'll take you so far, but it's still not going to eliminate the failure modes or the failure points in these housings outside of those areas. This can be reinforced, yes, but you know, instead of a band-aid, we can go to a complete housing, complete billet assembly housing, and eliminate all failure points. And that's even if you're running very heavy-duty tie rods and you won't have to worry about the rack anymore. There's no internal support on these racks for the rack rod, for the rack bar. The rack bar is sitting on its bearing, on this bearing here. So that's one point of support in the factory rack. The other point is it's being captured between the pinion shaft and this load bolt. And that's it. You've got two tiny little plastic bushings on the end, which as far as I'm concerned really aren't support. They're maybe better than nothing, but not much better. So, you know, of course in our billet housing we run much bigger, beefier bushings. And then internally in our housing, our center shaft area here has centered bronze bushings that are taking up most of the load, making sure that that shaft stays completely straight throughout. It also keeps proper gear alignment between the pinion and the rack gear, so that you're not having bad wear there. And yeah, you won't have to worry about it. So these ribs are added, but the rest of the housing, other than the larger end here, is basically the same housing. There's almost no more extra material added anywhere except for just a little bit in the ribs that they've added. A little bit of gusseting, a little bit of ribs, but the thickness of this housing, and particularly around this bolt here, is exactly the same thickness. So it's not a stronger housing in material or material thickness. It does have some reinforced areas of the housing, but again, they don't eliminate the most common failure modes on the HOSS 2.0 versus the HOSS 3.0. It's not taking care of it, guys. If you're going to break one of these, you're going to break one of these. So that's where I recommend our solution, the VX Rock Rack. And let's just bring that in for a side-by-side comparison. There you go. You're not going to break this, I guarantee it. It's a lifetime guarantee. No questions asked. If you guys break this, let me know. I'll take care of it. But if anybody can break it, I can. Trust me, and I've tried many times, and I will continue to keep trying. We are running this in our rig, the VX Offroad Bronco, and we're loving it. I love having the confidence to know I can go out and tackle any trail without having to worry about a steering failure that ends my day and means I have to get extricated from a trail. Nobody wants to be there, so this will make sure you don't have to worry about that. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get a hold of my buddy Zach and let him know the damage and see how he wants to proceed. All right, thanks for watching, guys.